For our final gender studies presentation, we decided to discuss voting rights, the importance of voter turnout. My name is Abilene.
My name's Lamar.
My name's Christian.
I'm Luke.
And my name is Tressa.
Our overall thesis statement for this presentation is that voter turnout is undervalued in our current democratic society. By focusing on voter turnout, democratic governments can give voices to the unheard and benefit society as a whole. We believe that compulsory voting laws are a viable long-term solution that will increase voter turnout.
Since established, voting in the United States has been full of barriers, from the exclusion of women, Black folk, Indigenous folk, people of color, and laws made to keep these voices from being heard. The history of voting rights is long, and there's still more work that needs to be done. The United States has struggled to yield high voter turnout in elections, local and national, with only 50% of those eligible to vote returning a ballot. This leads to elected officials that are often not representative of the population and who create laws that only benefit a small percentage of individuals. Continued efforts to keep people from the polls, specifically BIPOC, include voter registration processes that are complicated and difficult to understand, voting locations only open during times of school and work, and polling locations centered around white neighborhoods, to name a few. The current system and process for voting is exclusive and change needs to happen. So to start off this slide, I wanted to first give a simple definition of compulsory voting so that everyone is on the same page. Compulsory voting is when registering to vote and attendance in a vote for those eligible is required. The main benefit of this is that it acts as a solution for low voter turnout. Along with that, it has the possibility to increase voter turnout, close the socioeconomic status voting gap, and protect democratic values, all things the United States needs to truly have a representative government. Earlier in this presentation, we briefly discussed why change in the system was needed, but as a brief refresher, low voter turnout leads to political inequality and lack of representation for minority populations. Our current system of voting is exclusive in nature. Many people are hesitant to adopting a system of compulsory voting, worrying about their right not to vote. This will be addressed later in the presentation in more detail, but to put it simply, compulsory voting isn't requiring anyone to vote. It is requiring someone to register to vote and cast a ballot. That ballot can be blank or have an option selected that says none of these candidates are options. Another concern is that compulsory voting addresses the symptom of low voter turnout, but not the cause. Though this may be true, compulsory voting opens up a door to having conversations about low voter turnout and tries to do something about it. It may not be the perfect system, but all change starts somewhere. Mandatory voting will likely result in a voting system that is easier to participate in. If it is a requirement or law to vote, it is reasonable to believe that the process of voting will be made easier to ensure everyone can fulfill that duty. Compulsory voting also gets rid of common reasons to abstain, such as only voting if peers are voting, because everyone would know that their eligible peers would be required to vote. It would also be irrational to abstain from voting in a system that makes voting easier than abstaining from a vote, leading to higher voter turnout and more representative government.
Next, we will discuss compulsory voting, voter turnout, and asymmetrical habit formation, as discussed by 3 separate authors. This study analyzed the aftermath of compulsory voting. The 3 authors studied the effects that compulsory voting laws had on individual habits. This included the recording of voter turnout and the recording of individual political party turnout. This study is focused in specific regions of Austria and Germany. It has been proven through this study, as well as many others, that compulsory voting in the short-term confines of its actual implementation does increase voter turnout. In a few reference studies, turnout actually skyrocketed drastically with surprising immediacy. Australia votes increased 30%, Argentina votes increased 18%, and a few other countries resulted similarly. In this particular study, it was found to increase turnout by about 3 percentage points. It was hypothesized that due to this increase, that vote count would be positively impacted for long periods of time after the end of compulsory voting. Studies done on other methods of instantiating habitual voting indicated that this was likely, such as the lasting voter turnout impacts of the Get Out and Vote campaigns. However, the aftermath of compulsory voting abolition resulted in a precise reversal of any previous habits of action performed by civilians. It seemed that this rule had a slight variation in its effect on the right versus left-wing political parties. Right-wing participants voted more prolifically than left-wing voters. This is referred to as asymmetrical mobilization. The author noted that the concept of civic duty is more widely valued by the right than by the left, which may account for the reasoning behind this discrepancy. Despite that, there's also a high likelihood that this is more representative of an ideological shift within the society than any direct result of compulsory voting. Based on the results of this study, one may hypothesize that individuals prioritize voter choice over voter turnout. There are other sets of data that suggest the act of voting itself increases the likelihood to vote again in the case of young voters who are more likely to vote again if they voted once already soon after their coming of age. However, this does not apply if it is coerced through compulsory voting. This result runs counter to the hypothesis initially made that compulsory voting would have a long-term effect on voter behavior.
Next, we're going to talk about the right not to vote in the context of Lisa Hill's article, Does Compulsory Voting Violate a Right Not to Vote? She explores in this article if the right not to vote should be regarded with the same moral and legal protections as the right to vote. Her overall argument is that the right not to vote essentially does not exist and does not deserve the same protections. Throughout this article, Lisa Hill explains that the mere existence of a right does not constitute the inverse of that right. One potent example of this is the right to not be physically assaulted. All humans have the right to not be physically assaulted. This does not mean that they also have a right to be physically assaulted. Hill uses this example to reason that a right does not constitute complete, absolute freedom. It constitutes a mutual respect between individuals and the giving up of some freedoms for the betterment of society. Hill uses the example of slavery to further this point. If there were an individual willing to be enslaved, the government would not view their desire to waive their human rights as legitimate, and they would do this in order to promote a slavery-free society. Therefore, the right not to vote has no reason to be protected legally because the government strives to create a democratic society. Hill explains that an individual who chooses not to vote is essentially taking advantage of the benefits of a democratic society without offering any contribution. She argues that voting is a mix between a right and a duty. She compares voting to the likes of a policeman having the right and duty to arrest criminals. A policeman may not morally enjoy the idea of locking someone up for their misdeeds, but they have a right and a duty as law enforcement to do so. In the same vein, us as citizens of a democratic society have the right and duty to participate in democracy, because without participation, democracy fails. Finally, Hill points out that we have a duty to our fellow citizens, especially in regard to social class, to create change. She uses the example of women voters. She mentions that if she, as a woman, is the only woman to vote, she risks the possibility of being dominated by male voices. Therefore, women have a duty to other women to vote. Hill concludes that voting, while individual in action, is not about the individual. Voting is about bettering the democratic society for everyone. She concludes that waiving this right and duty is irresponsible and goes in the face of democracy.
We're going to talk about how social participation positively affects the voter turnout. Many people choose not to vote because of primarily apathetic reasons, but usually when they are socially involved with many things such as communities, they are more likely to vote with enthusiasm. Social participation isn't actually just a word, it's also called the social participation theory. And there were three theories that were used with three subjects, which is voluntary associations, communities, and churches. I had 2 and 3 hypotheses, or 2 are right, and in the end, it's proved that not even actually social participation theory could actually justify why many people don't exactly vote, but it's also many other things that can influence them, such as personal relationships, but it's not exactly as effective as social participation. Usually people who usually has less interest with the outside world, usually referred to as introverts, usually don't really ever vote. And because of this, they usually negatively affect the low vote turnout.
So expansive citizenship, voting beyond territory and membership. In this article, the author, Rainer Burbach, basically talks about how different countries have different requirements for citizens and immigrants to vote in its government elections, both with them in the country and without. And immigrants have more voting rights compared to immigrants, especially if they are outside their home country. So countries such as Israel and Nicaragua require that their citizens actually come back to their countries in order to vote for their elections. But in Israel, if a person comes under the law of return, which is basically if you are a Jew born anywhere in the world and do not have an Israeli citizenship, you can come back to Israel and get one. But if they do not have one, they can vote in local elections. And most Latin American countries have their citizens who live outside those countries visit the embassy of the country that they live in so they can cast their ballots for their home country's government elections. And like I said before, for immigrants, they have different requirements when it comes to voting and not as many rights as immigrants. But in certain cases, like in Canada, a British-born citizen can vote in elections for some provinces like Nova Scotia and Saskatchewan. This hasn't always been like this. In fact, the government actually frowned upon this until the 1970s when people started to travel more because they viewed it as strengthening their political ties with their citizens in the countries that they are in.
Next, we will discuss the connections among all of these readings. The first theme connecting readings is minority representation. Tressa discussed the various benefits that would come from an increase in voter turnout, things like socioeconomic representation and representation for other minorities. We are shown that compulsory voting would definitely increase turnout through habit formation article study, which would help those benefits be realized. The second theme among readings is the idea of voting as a civic duty. Luke discussed this concept in depth. The reading he summarized also talked about how the right not to vote is not a right at all and does not warrant protection. Lamar helped us identify why it is so difficult for people to recognize that truth. It is because voters are apathetic and uninvested. This apathy is why compulsory voting may be necessary. A high level of apathy is proven in the habit formation studies, which show that voters will likely revert to inaction rather than adopting civic responsibility as a norm if compulsory voting regulations are revoked. Christian discusses the interesting ramifications of emigration on the idea of civic duty. It raises questions that are yet to be answered. Using Luke's reading as a lens, do immigrants still have the civic duty to vote? Does the right not to vote become something that does not exist within certain contexts? Lastly, a few of the readings are connected by the alternatives to compulsory voting that they offer. Lisa Hill in her writing and the habit formation study both discuss the current voter environment. Right now, get out and vote campaigns promote voting and seem to get results. Being involved in organizations does the same thing. Both of these bond voters together. Voters feel the incurrence of more responsibility towards each other, therefore increasing voting. Encouraging organizational involvement and funding get out and vote campaigns are both viable counterclaims to the argument for implementing compulsory voting.
So with that all being said, let's take a look at the past readings. A past reading from this class that connects well with this project on voting rights is Week 11's What Determines How Americans Perceive Their Social Class by Bird and Newport in 2017. In the reading, it talks about how socioeconomics and how Americans today view their class in terms of wealth, education, occupation, etc. And this connects with the project because Tressa pointed out in her slide that compulsory voting helps balance socioeconomic voter turnout by closing that status gap. Another article of our past readings that connects well with this project is the article The Intersectionality Wars by Vox. And in the article, it talks about how a woman named Kimberly Crenshaw, who is working to demolish radical hierarchies with intersectionality, making everyone equal and represented. And the reason why this connects to this project is because compulsory voting can make sure that all minorities are represented.
Taking into account all of these readings and these summaries, we can conclude that compulsory voting will allow for a better understanding of voting as a civic duty. Compulsory voting may also create more voter turnout, which will allow for a more sound democratic society. That's our presentation. We appreciate your time and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.